Welcome, everybody, to this Clearly Sustainable interview series on sustainability. In this week of Valentine's Day, I'm speaking with Catherine Dunne about love and sustainability. Catherine is a practicing psychotherapist of 25 years' experience, and she explains about how we are all hardwired for love and connection. We speak also of the role of love in building a more sustainable future. Catherine, thanks again for talking to us. This is coming up for Valentine's Week and love is in the air. Your own work, love will come in many facets, or maybe the absence of love. As a psychotherapist, your work has introduced you to a lot of angles on this. Can you explain for us about the relationship between love and a more sustainable future?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is it's an enormous question, but a really interesting question, I think, about to inquire into. I'm not sure I have an answer.
Sure.
But as an inquiry, I think it's pretty fascinating. I think the thing I'd start with is that we're wired for love and for connection. Research into attachment, for instance, the first relationship a baby has with its primary carer, that first bonds, or those first bonds, more and more we are coming to understand just what a huge impact that can have on our experience of love, relationship, connection, and even our relationship to ourselves. So when babies are born, they are looking for things like someone to attune to them, someone to mirror back to them. The gazing that happens between a baby, a young baby, and its primary care, whether that's its mother or whomever, has been examined in depth, and how much is happening, and the sense of love and connection that can get conveyed there, and how powerful that is in laying down all kinds of our hard wiring. So we're wired for it. We come in and we sort of start from there.
Right.
So from that point of view, in terms of being, just an embodied human, those that don't have a sense of being loved or being lovable tend not to do very well.
Yeah.
That
you can see it sometimes more in the absence, in a way.
Yeah, well, it depends. I suppose we see the problems in the absence.
The negative angle.
Yeah, like lots of things that we have a need for, when we have it, we can take it for granted and just build on it. And I think love can be a little bit like that. It's something we're acutely aware of if we don't have it. And when we do have it, what it enables us to go on to is...
The Dalai Lama refers to it as fundamental for our species.
Absolutely, yeah.
So both individually and collectively.
Yeah, he does. He says that it's not a luxury.
Yeah.
It's essential, because the compassion and the peace that love brings, without it we don't continue. And I think we can see, on an individual and on a collective level, love connects. And when there's an absence of love, we can experience profound disconnect. And that profound disconnect can manifest in all kinds of things. So when we make people other than us, when we lose our sense of being part of something bigger, our sense of belonging can be rooted in our sense of being loved and being worthy.
Yeah.
And so if we don't have that, our disconnect means we are lacking potentially in empathy, in our ability to connect and feel our impact, to know how powerful we are and how much impact we have on others, on the world. Someone who doesn't feel loved and as a result might not have a very good sense of self-worth may feel, I don't matter. What I do doesn't count, for instance.
Yeah.
And so that sense of being loved, worthy, mattering, connected to another and others on a larger scale enables us to take our place more as a human being alive at this time and part of what's happening.
So it's way bigger than the Valentine's Week interpersonal romantic love, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, romantic love is a really interesting aspect of the conversation around love. I think romantic love is often someplace where we can get very confused. You know, we have lots of romantic love stories, and I think often that some of that love isn't necessarily based in love at all. It might be based in need or longing or an unresolved attachment, you know, trying to get something that we're missing. And you'd often hear people say something like, you know, but I love her, but I love him. And that, it's not that it isn't true, it's just that sometimes what we have come to understand love to be in that romantic context, I think is a bit skewed.
Dependent or needy?
Yeah, it might be more about dependence, it might be more about wanting someone else to validate that we are okay or enough. And of course, you know, within a loving relationship, all those things happen at times. But if that's what it's based on, if I love you because I need you to give me this, then it all starts getting very confusing, and chances are you're operating more out of need or fear or lack than love.
Okay.
And there's a paradox in that.
All right.
Because, you know, in some ways, one of the greatest assets a human can have is to have been well loved. If you know what it is to really be loved, that stands to you. That's something you can take inside you and take out into the world when you go. If you haven't had that, for all sorts of reasons, as a child and later on in your life, if you've never had that sense of having been loved, it's very difficult to give it, and it's very difficult to get it. So there's this kind of paradox, whereas we need to be loved to know how to do it and to get that generosity in ourselves, and yet if we haven't had it, we're seeking it. So the power of loving one another well is I think not to be underestimated. You know, we've spoken in the past about kindness.
Yeah.
And the power of kindness as a way of bringing up that collective level of acceptance and love, because we need to have some sense of being able to love ourselves in order to really be able to love another.
Yes.
And so how do we get that so that we can...
There's a sort of a yin and yang to it, you know.
Yeah, there's a give and take to it. And so The romantic love thing, I think, is tricky.
Yeah.
I think it can be,
because it becomes commodified of all weeks of the year.
Well, yeah, and I think interestingly reflects some of our longing around that. I mean, I think, if we look at dating sites and the industry around Valentine's Day and I think celebrating love in all forms is beautiful, and yet there is a something driving that that would suggest maybe collectively we're not quite satiated in that place, that there is a hunger and a longing. And of course we can tend to project that onto, if somebody else loved me, if I had somebody, and absolutely, I don't,
helps.
having somebody is great.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, eventually things will return to our relationship with ourselves, and the extent to which, and the ongoing journey of learning how to love oneself. And that, again, then we get into that, the stronger that capacity, then the stronger your capacity to love another, and then the stronger your capacity there for that to extend
out through community and society. And what about Mama Earth then? And is there a sort of could you maybe describe it that because we're disconnected from the earth, we don't love it and take care of it as we would a loved one? It's like a store cupboard rather than a life support system, the way we treat the earth.
And it's like, we see this in all kinds of places, where, so a really simple example would be maybe an adolescent, who's been well loved, but goes out in the world and for a period maybe, doesn't appreciate what they have at home, or the love or the care. And it's like through maturing and awakening, and maybe, often you hear people say, it wasn't until I had my own kids that I realized, oh my God, I have to go back and thank my mother, or thank my parents, or thank whoever. So I think it's a combination, a disconnect that means we can get, and this is again, and I think our industrial culture, and we've become a lot more isolated
from nature and environment.
From nature and from one another, in a sense.
So just to go back to the adolescent idea, are you suggesting that maybe we are collectively, if you like, adolescent and young adult and sort of carefree about how we love the earth and our planet? Is that where you
I think that might be one aspect. I don't know if I'd say that's it, but there is something about not being connected in a way that we have an appreciation, and that lack of appreciation can come out as a disconnect, a lack of relationship, a lack of awareness. But once that awakens, it's very hard to put it away, or to forget that it's been awakened. So another thing you'd often hear people say is, it really changed, life changed when I had my own kids, in terms of, for instance, I'd hear lots of women say, well, I used to be able to watch things on telly, but since I had my own kids, I can't watch that anymore. It hits too deep, because I have a relationship now and an understanding in a way I didn't before about the impact of that. And so, often people would say there's a polarization. There's love on the one hand and fear on the other. And love has us expand, and fear has us contract. So are we operating out of love, which relaxes us and allows us to expand and extend our awareness? Or are we operating out of fear, which often results in us contracting and narrowing our gaze because we're not feeling safe or resourced enough? And I think it's safe to say that the more able we are to stay on that love end of the spectrum, the more capacity we have to relate, to connect, to have empathy for others, and extend that even to the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And that capacity for empathy, for staying with whatever is true for us in that place, and following through on that, so that translates into how we live and how we act and how we are with one another, whether that be at home or in our communities or with the earth. The more we expand our capacity for love, and I would suggest the more sustainable we become individually and collectively.
Yeah. So it's a kind of a learnt behaviour, and all the way as within, so without. A little bit with it.
I think that's definitely true. Yeah. And from that point of view, you know, the more alignment there is, the more love one has for oneself, the more capacity one tends to have for love of another. And you know, and again, it's cyclical, because that capacity tends to it's not the only way it can happen, but how well loved you have been often contributes to how able you are to love. That's not to say that if you haven't been well loved, you can't, because there's plenty of examples of people who came from very difficult situations and developed extraordinary capacity for love. So it's not but it's an interest. I think it speaks to the fact where I started, that we're wired for it.
Yeah.
We're wired for connection, to love and be loved, to belong, to be part of something, to know our place, to know our place is secure, and that whatever happens, we're not alone. And whether you have that from birth, whether you get that in relationship subsequently, whether you get that spiritually, however you get that sense, that experience and that knowing of love is, I believe, an enormous resource.
Yeah.
And has an enormous amount to do with how sustainable we are individually and collectively.
My thanks to Catherine for sharing her wisdom and insights on the topic of love and sustainability. We hope you enjoyed listening to this interview on the Clearly Sustainable series. You can find more interviews and podcasts on our website, clearlysustainable.com. Thank you.